Alright guys, ok non je parle français, bonjour à tous, salut les caps. Aujourd'hui dans la vidéo on va réagir à Candace Owens qui a sa petite intro. Alright guys, ok, oui bien sûr. Donc Candace Owens elle lâche un énorme dossier inédit sur Jean-Michel Trogneux concernant l'affaire Brigitte. Elle va récapituler toute la chronologie de la famille Trogneux et notamment de Jean-Michel en évoquant tous les points suspects, notamment pendant sa jeunesse étudiante et pendant sa vie de jeune adulte. Et il va la relier à celle de Brigitte pour montrer justement les points d'incohérence finalement qui mènent à une forme de discorde et donc qui mènent à se renseigner et finalement à se questionner sur la véritable identité de Jean-Michel Trogneux qu'on nous a présenté comme le petit gros et celle de Brigitte qu'on nous présente comme la femme d'Emmanuel Macron mais qui peut-être en réalité serait donc une autre personne. Bon, tout ça est un peu tiré par les cheveux, mais comme je vous ai dit, chaque vidéo de Candace, chaque indice qu'on peut avoir concernant l'affaire Brigitte, c'est un morceau de puzzle qui vient compléter le puzzle final. La question, c'est quand est-ce que nous aurons le puzzle final? Moi, je pense, les amis, qu'on s'y rapproche. Mais bon, avant de commencer, mettez un énorme pouce bleu, abonnez-vous à la chaîne YouTube et mettez un petit commentaire. Mettez votre avis sur l'affaire Brigitte pour vous, justement, quand est-ce que tout ça va éclater? Quand est-ce que la vérité finalement va éclater, sachant qu'aujourd'hui, on me rappelle comme que le couple Macron a porté plainte aux États-Unis contre Candace Owens. Donc là, ça s'annonce coriace. Allez, c'est parti. Alors évidemment, j'ai mis les sous-titres, donc voilà, il n'y a pas de traduction orale, mais il y a les sous-titres. Donc je vous ai agrandi la vidéo pour vous. C'est parti.
Equally, if not more interesting, actually way more interesting, potentially something. Okay, it's a potentially something. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm only presenting this because we want more information, and this has been an open investigation. Like I said, it would be a closed investigation if they themselves could answer these questions, but they can't because privacy, privacy, privacy. Yeah, well, just to recap before we get to this photo. The trail of Jean-Michel Trogneux runs completely cold just before 1970, okay? So I'm going to go back to that timeline that we presented throughout our Becoming Brigitte series because you probably need a little bit of a refresh here. Here we go. We just traced Jean-Michel Trogneux's life from being born in 1945, but the relevant portion that I want you guys to look at is in 1963, because in 1963, that is the year that Jean-Michel Trogneux turns 18, okay? And at that time in France, military men were required to sign up for the military. It was compulsive. You're 18 years old, you have to sign up, or else you have to present a valid reason as to why you cannot join the military at that time. So we know that on February 12th, 1963, according to Xavier Poussard's stellar reporting, the day after Jean-Michel Trogneux's 18th birthday, his father, Jean Trogneux, performs the military registration on his son's behalf. And what's weird about that year is that in that file, as his father is filing for a deferment, we learn that Jean-Michel is living in Algeria at the beginning of that year. Then we know that by the end of that year, by the end of that same year, he's back in France and he is at an engineering school, okay? That's where Xavier and the journalists were able to hunt down that now infamous photo, that 1963, I think 64 photo of Jean-Michel from, like it was an engineering school in France. Okay, cool. Xavier Poussard then was able to confirm in his book that 2 years later, in 1965, Jean-Michel requests another military deferment for 2 years, which would bring us to 1967. And thanks to a mainstream journalist, remember the story goes that people started realizing that there was one sibling that was unaccounted for, like Brigitte Macron is now the First Lady of France, and they're looking at this photo and they're like, wait a second, we know where all of these siblings allegedly are, but we don't know where that little guy on the left is that kind of looks exactly like Brigitte, Jean-Michel. And because the press was able to get ahead of it and like, oh yeah, that is kind of a missing sibling, let's look into him. A mainstream journalist was able to confirm that Jean-Michel Trogneux in 1967 was in Speyer, Germany, okay? There he was registered as a non-commissioned officer playing field hockey at the Speyer Club for the season 1967 to 1968. So that's where he was. He was in Germany. And that could make sense because they had an engineering regiment in Spire at that time. Militarily speaking, that could make sense. But then, after 1967, 1968, the trail runs cold. We don't know what happened to Jean-Michel Trogneau through documentation. But what we do know is that Xavier Poussard has tried to access his military file further. Right. And we know that that military file was not closed until 1981. Okay, so Xavier Poussard went to them and said, I would like to look at this file. It's been a very long time, obviously, to see what this guy was up to for these years. And the military said, no dice, you cannot have it. And their reasons was that it would reveal private medical information. Okay. So it was a privacy concern. There's private medical information here. You cannot have it. Okay. So the broader question, which we have had since the beginning of the series, is what the heck was Jean-Michel doing for the military throughout those years, right? What was he doing from 1968 to 1981 for the military? And what's interesting is that we know for a fact that Brigitte Macron claims throughout that time, if we can put her anywhere, that she was in America for the moon landing. Again, this was before this entire scandal broke, so she was maybe saying too much, but that's definitely interesting and would be something that we would want to ask her under oath. She told a journalist back in 2021, here's the headline, okay, so you can check it out yourself, and the headline here is Brigitte Macron is nostalgic for her American youth. I was there when Armstrong walked on the moon. Yeah, here's the direct quotation from that article. It reads, again, this is Brigitte giving the statement, translated from French. She said, "This is the country where I went the most when I was a teenager," she said during her interview with Alba Ventura. "I was there when Armstrong set the step on the moon. I experienced this with the Americans." Okay, that's very interesting. So she is saying that on July 20th, 1969, she experienced that moment with Americans. Okay, the wife of the head of state is saying that after everything that she's gone through, she has this affinity with America. She also says elsewhere in the article, I've been through this with the Americans, referring to the moon landing, and says, quote, "I have memories, and the memories of adolescence are those that remain in our hearts." Okay, you love America. Well, America loves you back. If you could tell us what you were doing here, where you were celebrating that, who exactly you were with when you were celebrating that. So this is why this next portion is super interesting, because somebody on X, and again, I will caution you, we're just investigating here. We are literally just asking questions, and it's always faster to just go to the public because the internet sleuths are the best. This is like our own CIA. This is like the Candace intelligence agency of mommy and daddy sleuths out there. Well, somebody on X got my attention when they alleged that they saw someone that they were convinced resembled Jean-Michel Trogneau in a documentary that they were watching regarding the Stanford University prison experiment. Okay, here's a tweet, just so you know. I didn't make this up. This is the tweet. I was watching the TV show about the Stanford prison experiment. Episode 1 shows a side profile of this young man. At the 5-minute, 45-second mark, I had to rewind and look again. And I went, whoa. That's look. I'm not exactly like a technology here, but definitely looks familiar. And talking about psychology, everything that we have been discussing on this podcast regarding psychology, reading of chaos, it got my attention. Okay, and then when you learn what the Stanford prison experiment was, it kind of piques your interest even further. What was the Stanford prison experiment? Well, it was one of the most controversial psychological experiments in history. Not kidding, in history. It was controversial not only because of what was done, but also controversial because years later, a French historian basically looked back on everything and said, this was theater. These people were actually performing. A lot of the things the public was told simply weren't true. They did this experiment because they wanted to produce a certain result. But let me tell you about it. Here's what we know for a fact, okay? What we know for a fact is that the experiment just took place in 1971, and it was funded by the United States Navy and the Marines. Okay, it was funded by the military because they wanted to explore antisocial behavior. They wanted to determine whether or not, when placed under extreme pressure and abuse, okay, think about that. They wanted to know whether or not, when placed under extreme pressure and abuse, you could transform psychologically healthy individuals into individuals that will engage in twisted behavior. Like, will you join the crowd? You go in, you sit there, you're a healthy person, you're not a person that would do anything demented. Well, if we keep pushing and prodding and abusing you, will you join in? Nobody ever knows why our military and Navy is interested. Nobody can answer the question why they're interested in these sort of freaky experiments. But I digress. You already know my opinions about psychology. Anyways, the way it worked was they put out an ad in the newspaper. This was just for people on campus, and they found 24 healthy male students. They selected 24 out of 75 students, applicants that were then screened for psychological and medical issues to make sure they didn't have any. And the participants were then randomly assigned to play either the role of a prisoner in the simulation or a guard in this mock prison setting. Essentially, the presiding psychologist, this total creep. I mean, I look at him, I'm just like, ick, super ick. Philip Zimbardo and some graduate students, they simulated a prison environment and they just investigated the psychological effects of perceived power and situational roles. The guards became increasingly authoritarian, and we are told that the guards were a part of the experiment, okay? They became increasingly authoritarian, abusive, sadistic, while the prisoners showed signs of extreme distress and eventually submission. The experiment was initially planned to go for 2 weeks, but then it had to be terminated after just 6 days due to the extreme psychological reactions and behaviors that were being displayed by the participants, both the guards and the prisoners alike. And apparently that guy's wife is the one that shut it down. She's also a psychologist, Christina Maslach. She comes in, she's like, oh my gosh, you're suffering too much. We got to end this experiment of these graduate students who are now engaging in abuse of each other. Anyways, I'm going to show you a clip of one of these quote unquote guards who loved speaking about his role.
Ok, donc là, elle va montrer un extrait. Bon, je pense qu'on va s'arrêter là parce que après, elle dérive sur autre chose. En fait, ce qui est vraiment intéressant, c'est cette chronologie, justement, comme elle le dit. Cette chronologie entre Jean-Michel Trogneux, qui d'un côté fait son service militaire, mais qui avoue aussi en même temps avoir eu une partie de sa vie de jeune adulte en Algérie. De l'autre côté, on a Brigitte Macron qui nous avoue que pendant son adolescence, notamment pendant l'alunissage de Armstrong en 69, elle vit l'alunissage justement avec les Américains en Amérique. Moi, je pose une question qu'elle n'a pas dit, Candace Owens. Comment, quand tu es une ado, ce qu'elle a littéralement dit qu'elle avait passé plusieurs temps en Amérique. Comment tu vas en Amérique quand tu es ado? Avec quel argent? Avec quel argent? Puis c'est compliqué d'aller aux États-Unis seul, non? Quand tu es adolescent. C'est pas hyper chaud d'aller aux États-Unis quand tu es mineur, quand t'as pas. C'est bizarre quand même. Donc pareil, oui, effectivement, je rejoins Candace sur avec qui tu étais et pour quelle raison. Tu vas pas aux États-Unis comme ça, non. Hormis si tu es la fille d'un milliardaire et que tu passes ta vie à voyager, mais je veux dire, en dehors de ça, dans la vie réelle, tu travailles, tu as des études. Comment se fait que Brigitte Macron passe son temps aux États-Unis pendant son adolescence? C'est bizarre quand même. Donc on a un frère qui est en Algérie. Alors pareil, hein, on passe du coq à l'âne. Je dirais même on passe du coq à light entre le frère en Algérie et la sœur aux États-Unis. C'est deux mondes différents, surtout à cette époque-là. Donc très étrange. Ensuite pareil, donc le service militaire. Xavier Poussard qui veut accéder au dossier concernant Jean-Michel Trogneux, puis on nous révèle que finalement on ne peut pas parce que ça va dévoiler des informations médicales suspectes. Donc justement. Est-ce que justement, là ça rejoint la thèse donc, de Xavier Poussard sur le changement d'identité. Est-ce que justement le dossier médical en question, ce n'est pas un changement d'identité, donc ça peut être une transition, ça peut être n'importe quoi, hein, qui mettrait justement en péril l'honneur et la dignité de Brigitte Macron, qui en fait serait donc actuellement, serait Jean-Michel Trogneux qui a été en Algérie et qui a eu son service militaire, blablabla. Voilà, c'est en tout cas, elle met la lumière sur un point très intéressant. Alors si je dis pas de bêtises, je crois que Xavier Poussard avait déjà dit plus ou moins ça sur GPTV l'été dernier, je crois. Non, je dis des bêtises, cet hiver. Il n'avait pas été aussi loin, mais il avait révélé pas mal de choses dans ce genre-là. Mais très intéressant. Merci Candace, parce que là, pareil, ça rajoute un point de. Ça met la lumière sur un nouveau point dont on n'avait pas existence ou pas entièrement. Donc très intéressant. Je vous laisse évidemment regarder le reste sur sa chaîne YouTube. Je ne vais pas mettre le lien parce qu'en plus ça met un extrait de vidéo après dont je n'ai pas les droits, donc je préfère pas dériver là-dessus. Mais voilà. En tout cas, merci beaucoup d'avoir suivi la vidéo. Le petit pouce bleu qui fait plaisir. L'abonnement, bien évidemment, qui, je dirais, est obligatoire, finalement, hein. Allez, rendez-vous dans quelques heures demain pour une prochaine vidéo. Paix et amour sur mes amis et mes ennemis. Et surtout, surtout, sur mes ennemis.